But I've been asked today to make some comments on leadership based on the book that John mentioned, Power, Ambition, Glory, which compared 6 ancient leaders and then some modern business leaders, and make some observations about the economy and then open it up for questions and discussion. In terms of leadership, any kind of leadership, particularly with the economy, one of the key things is, and it's a cliche but absolutely true, is thinking outside the box. It's very easy to do what others do. Few will criticize you for doing what others do, but that is not what you're there to do. You're there to give a pair of eyes and try to see things a little differently from others, where you can, using the phrase, provide real value added. My brothers and I learned that at an early age with stories about our grandfather. He was an immigrant to this country a little over 100 years ago, one of 10 children, grade school education, no money. He started out in business journalism, wanted to be a business reporter, and eventually started the company back in 1917, 93 years ago. In the first issue of Forbes, he said the purpose of business is to produce happiness, not to pile up money. And I think that has been the ethos we've tried with our media company since then, is to see that there is a purpose. It's not just material, but more profoundly, having an environment where people can discover their inner talents and develop those talents in a way that had not been possible before, without the advent of free markets. My grandfather also said, and this is something that's still with us today, he said, you'll learn more about the prospects of a company not looking at the balance sheet, but at the head knocker. That's what he called CEOs. And he said leadership will make the difference in whether a company succeeds or not. And we've all seen in recent times what leadership has done to destroy great balance sheets and what leadership has done to resurrect seemingly hopeless balance sheets. People make the difference. And even today in Forbes, when we do company stories, well, even though the stories are chock-a-block full of numbers, and numbers are simply shorthand for realities of a company or an economy, not numbers in and of themselves. They are meant to convey pictures. But even though the stories are full of numbers, they always focus on individual or individuals. People make the difference. And that, I guess, is one of the reasons why we did this book. We learned stories about my grandfather when he tried to find his first job here. He got off the boat, went to various editors, got turned down everywhere, and so he put it on the line. One of the things you learn in studying about people is there are times when you don't know what the outcome is going to be, and you just have to take the risk. You have to put it on the line. What he did is he went to an editor one day and said, I'll offer to work for you for free for a few weeks, show you my worth, and I hope that if I show you my worth, you will hire me. Well, my grandfather had no idea whether this individual would hire him or just use his free labor and then toss him out. But he felt he had to do something beyond the norm of simply knocking on doors and put it on the line. Well, he got the job eventually, and he was so full of energy and ambition, he then went to and got eventually another job with another publication using a different name. And probably one of his happiest moments in his life was when the two editors one day, true story, got into an argument as to who had the best business reporter. It was my grandfather in both cases. But again, creativity, innovation is about doing things that are unusual. And just one other story on my grandfather is that he came from Scotland, and Scots are very tight with the money. That's the image. And it certainly was true of him. Spending money was something that was done with great reluctance. And one day he did something, a couple of things that his friends thought the man must have gone crazy, taken leave of his senses, maybe he needed a vacation. But he went out and bought a couple of suits, expensive suits. In those days, 90 years ago, 100 years ago, a suit was a big deal. You spent proportionately a lot of money on it. So for a Scotsman to pay up for two of them was quite something. Then he did something even seemingly more bizarre. He rented a room at the Waldorf Astoria, then the poshest hotel in the world. And so his friends thought, what's happened to you? Well, he again was putting it on the line. He realized that the makers and shakers of the day all congregated at the Waldorf after hours. Many of them had rooms or apartments there. And he figured if he was there properly dressed as a guest, he could get to know these people, or some of them, on a personal basis and learn things that he could never do across a desk in a formal interview, and thereby get a leg up on his peers. And it worked. For that kind of thing, and those kind of stories growing up with, it seemed a natural extension. When a classicist, I'd written a review of this fellow's book, a fellow named John Previs, and I wrote this Power, Ambition, Glory with him a couple of years ago, came out a few months ago. As you know, with books, they have long gestation periods. It just takes forever. But in terms of, he'd written a book on Hannibal, and I wrote a review of it because I thought it had some applicability to some business lessons today. He had read the review and said, why don't we get together? And he was doing a biography, brief biographies in these ancients. Why don't we see if we can apply them to modern business leaders? You know, you don't have to do a couple of pages after each chapter. Well, that sounded easy. And that was 2 years ago. It just ballooned. So looking at these ancient leaders, you do get lessons from them, that even though times and circumstances change, the essence of successful leadership do not change, essences do not change, and the mistakes that human beings make do not change. Human nature does not change. Times and circumstances do, but human nature profoundly does not change. And so you have everyone from, we started with Cyrus the Great. The Persians get a bad rap in history because the Greeks wrote it. Very important lesson there. In terms of how we see the past, who writes the history? Churchill and others recognize that. But Cyrus was an extraordinary empire builder in the sense that he realized it's not enough to put together an empire. How do you keep it together? Putting in structures, nitty-gritty structures, that can keep it together after you leave the scene. He was also, by the standards of the time, remarkably tolerant. Jewish historians talk about how enlightened a leader he was. As long as you paid the tribute to the center each year, you could do what you wanted to do. He had no desire to try to impose a uniform way of living or anything like that. So you provide the protection, and you paid him a little bit each year and left you alone. Well, the empire lasted several hundred years. And when you look at businesses today, not a bad thing. But I think in terms of today, a couple of leaders have real resonance today, and we're mentioning one of them at the table. One was one that you're not probably too familiar with, and that's a man named Xenophon. Came out of Athens. He was born as an aristocrat. And as a young man, he decided as a lark, sort of a sense of adventure, as young people are wont to do, to go with a group of mercenaries fighting in one of these succession wars in Persia. And this group of mercenaries, most of them from Sparta, about 10,000 of them, maybe that's Xenophon calling, so keep it up, but maybe from above or below, I'm not sure which, but Xenophon went along for the ride, so to speak. And with these hard-bitten mercenaries, most of them Spartans, who were the real hard warriors at the time, they went into Persia and ended up back on the wrong horse. The Spartans beat the Persians, but the rest of the army with this fellow who wanted the throne was two brothers fighting each other. Some things don't change. Cain, Abel, some things don't change. Fighting for the Persian throne. And they backed the wrong one. So suddenly they found themselves, 10,000 of them, in the middle of Persia, no supply lines, no supplies, cut off, and an army of about 1 million ready to annihilate them. Their leaders went to parley with the successful brother to try to secure passage out of Persia and get back to Greece. They were killed. One of them managed to escape and warn the others. And so the army was just bereft, just feeling the end has come. Surrounded, no supply, no cavalry coming. What to do? Now, as you know, the Athenians and the Spartans hated each other, constantly fought each other. So here was this Athenian, no previous military experience, rises and gives a speech, and in effect says, we don't have to meet this fate passively. Let's get ourselves together, bring in new leaders, and figure out a way to get ourselves out of this. Better to do something positive than just simply wait to be slaughtered. And it worked. Now think of that. No previous experience. This is something in life. Crises or opportunities come. You can't always plan on them. They can hit you from unexpectedly. And do you have the inner resources and character to be able to rise to the occasion? Even though there is no playbook, here's what you do, A, B, C, D. No, you got to make it up as you go along. There is no precedent for this. And he hadn't gone to the equivalent of a West Point or something, so he knew nothing other than just watching him marching along into a battle in Persia. But he won them over, but he was wise enough, even though they were ready to make him leader, he knew he was going to be a leader, but he was wise enough to know, I don't have their trust yet. So he had others take the formal lead, even though he was going to be calling a lot of shots behind the scenes. The other thing was that with these mercenaries, you did not give orders. You had an assembly, amazingly, for an army, and you had to convince these guys to do what you wanted them to do. So you had to persuade them each step of the way. So in effect, he did become the leader, figured out ways to move out, and he had to persuade them every step of the way. Now imagine, total outsider, absolutely unexperienced, had not been fought with them before because he came from Athens and these were mostly Spartans, and become their leader. And unlike today, if you fail in business, you might get a golden parachute. Then, if you didn't persuade them, you got stoned. They would stone you if they turned against you. Now, it's one thing when you face a common danger to engender some unity, but long story short, he did lead them out of the immediate danger, and as happens, when the immediate danger is gone, things start to fly apart. They turn against him. And more than once, he had to use his ability to persuade in an assembly from him being stoned to death because of charges made against him. And sometimes, too, in the case, and you learn this reading about Xenophon, sometimes a leader has to realize you're not master of the universe. And sometimes you just have to await events. There was a period where a group of the Spartans decided to break off, go off on their own. He told them it's a mistake. There are enemies out there who will overwhelm you. The only way we're going to move on and get to the shores is by sticking together, even though the immediate danger is over. They wouldn't listen to him, and he knew there was no way. He could try to bring them back, use the other Spartans to fight them, make them so they can't move out. But he realized that would be counterproductive, so he just had to wait events and hope they learned their lesson before they got destroyed. Sometimes with leadership, you have to accept passivity, just wait events. Well, in this case, it worked. But one of the ways that Xenophon engendered the trust, ultimately, was he lived with the men, suffered with them, did not give himself special privileges, made sure the wounded were brought along, even though sometimes that was extremely difficult to do. And so by having not just giving orders, he learned and he persuaded and he earned their trust. Again, an Athenian earning the trust of a Spartan, especially an Athenian who is an aristocrat among hard-bitten mercenaries, an extraordinary tale to remember today when we face crises. He rose to it. And he also knew his limitations, when you push and when you pull back, when you have others go out in front and you realize you better take a seeming demotion and let this thing work out. Leadership is an art, and he exemplified it. Now, of course, in terms of leadership, it's hard to believe in this day and age when we read about huge pay packages and the like, but if you're going to get ultimate satisfaction, it has to be inner. And Xenophon realized that, because as soon as he saved this army, he got word from Athens, don't come home. You're exiled. We don't want you. And so he ended up, eventually the Spartans let him go to Sparta. The king took a shine to him, let him farm there, spent his rest of his life in exile, no money, just living off the land. But thankfully he wrote histories that are, if you're a classicist, are classics. But He certainly did not get any money out of this thing, just the satisfaction he rose to an occasion, earned trust, and got something done that seemingly seemed impossible, rising to the occasion. By contrast, you go to Alexander the Great, extraordinary leader, huge success, but reference was made to self-discipline. Aristotle tried to teach him, before you conquer others, you must conquer yourself, i.e., learn to control your passions, learn self-discipline. Alexander never did. And so in one sense, he gendered trust, did great things on the battlefield and the like, but did not know when to stop, and was seduced by success. Hubris really applied to him. Did not know when to stop, kept pushing his men, on and on and on. For what purpose, nobody knew. Did not leave structures in place, just conquered for the sake of conquering. And in India, they mutinied. His army turned against him. He had to pull back. But so full of himself was Alexander that he sent part of the army into the desert where he knew they would perish as punishment for the mutiny. Well, his own officers, when they got back to Babylon, he was planning another campaign. His own officers turned on him, poisoned him, and as soon as he died, the empire split apart. It didn't last, unlike Cyrus, it didn't last a day. The generals split apart. Ptolemy went to Egypt. One of his descendants was Cleopatra, but the whole thing fell apart. Great leader, but he did not have an idea of succession or an idea of seeing that this goes beyond you, that if you don't look to the future, you're going to have no legacy at all. Did great things in terms of military history, but that's it, nothing lasting. And when Caesar Augustus visited Alexander's tomb, he made the point of saying, it's easy to put together an empire. It is much more difficult to keep an empire and enable it to last. True of empires, true of businesses, true of our own lives as well, personal lives. Hannibal is another one, and I'll get to some of the modern leaders. Hannibal, many lessons. One, extraordinary risk taker and innovator. He realized Carthage was going to eventually be destroyed by Rome, so instead of waiting, he decided to go on offense and decided instead of invading Italy from the south, from the sea, where you'd expect a naval power to do it, he'd go overland through Spain, where they had a colony, and hit them from the north via the Alps. And crossing the Alps in wintertime, in those times, he lost numerous numbers of his men. All the elephants survived the thing amazingly, but he hit them from the rear, beat them in several battles, including one where Rome threw all of its troops together, put in extra legions, and one of the reasons Hannibal succeeded was his extraordinary attention to detail. When you become a leader, you have to have that fine sense of attention to detail, but also entrusting things to your lieutenants, to your team. But on the day when the big battle came, Trasimene, he had already battered the Romans. They thought they'd now had him trapped in the Battle of Cannae, but he made sure on that battlefield that he took the initiative, that the winds would blow the dust. Armies churn up, and horses and elephants churn up a lot of dust, that the winds would be blowing it against the Romans. And he also took a huge risk. He led the center. These weren't, the Carthaginian army was mercenaries, and keeping a mercenary army together for hard battle is no easy feat. He spoke 8 languages fluently and worked hard at making sure this polyglot army stuck together. So he led the Celtic tribe in the center. He knew they were not good fighters, and he knew the Romans would push them back. You know anything about military history, it's very, very risky to do something where you know initially you're going to be pushed back because it could unravel everything else you're trying to do. So he led them in the center. He was going to make sure he was there to see that this thing worked. In effect, sucked the Romans in a valley. They thought they were pushing him back. Instead, he enveloped them with his cavalry and others and killed more soldiers in that afternoon than any battle since, about 70,000. Destroyed the Roman army. But then Hannibal did something that even today is sometimes hard to appreciate. Heady victory, destroyed the greatest army of the greatest power in the world. But he also knew limitations. Daring, innovator, but also knew limitations. Historians have always wondered since, why didn't he march on Rome? Well, he figured if he marched on Rome itself, maybe he could take it, although maybe he couldn't. He did not have the siege equipment to do it. But he figured even if he took it physically, there was still enough left in the Roman Empire where they could beat him. And instead he realized the way you break the will of this empire is to destroy its morale by handing it, not trying to briefly occupy the city, but hit the outside of the periphery of the city and the empire and just wear them down, break their morale. Napoleon did not learn that 2,000 years later when he invaded Russia, thought when he occupied Moscow it was over. No, it was not over. Occupying a city does not destroy your enemy. Hannibal realized that 2,000 years before Napoleon. You also learn from Hannibal, again, you're not master of the universe. His home, Carthage, would not give him the necessary resources and the equipment to finish the job. Nothing he could do about it. And then, another thing you learn from Hannibal, if you're successful as a leader, others will imitate you. Competitors will imitate you. And in the case of Hannibal, his imitator was a fellow named Scipio, whose father and uncle had been killed in the early part of that war. So instead of raging about it, he thought the best revenge was victory. So he studied Hannibal assiduously. Why couldn't a Roman army beat him on the field in direct battle? What were his tactics? What were his strategies? And so he finally persuaded, after much trouble, the Roman Senate to allow him to take an army first to Spain and then do a reverse Hannibal and invade North Africa. And he did it, and the Carthaginian government panicked and told Hannibal, we want to recall you. We've got this invading army. And Hannibal said, you can take care of the army. They can't breach the walls. But if you pull me out of Italy, it's over. I'll never be able to get back to Italy again. Don't call me back. They did. He knew it was a mistake, but he obeyed orders. Sometimes you're not the master of your universe. You can't do this, do that. All of us have constraints of one sort or another. Came back to Carthage. Scipio was ready to do battle, and Battle of Zama, for those of you who are interested. And because Scipio had studied Hannibal so much, he out-Hannibaled Hannibal in this battle. Knew how to neutralize the elephants through strange noises, through maneuvers where, since elephants aren't easy to maneuver, just create a gap. Easy to say, quite hard to train an army to do it, to let these things run through. Scipio won. Unlike his successors, he had a generous peace with Carthage. But a lot of lessons to be learned from Hannibal. And then, of course, other leaders, Julius Caesar, hubris, conquered more than Alexander, did practice forgiveness of his enemies, but because of his hubris, he didn't realize which enemies could you trust, former enemies could you trust, and which would be consumed by jealousy or have real differences and turn on you. So it's one thing to be forgiving, but if you're a leader, you also have to know who you can turn your back to and who you better have faced face to face. And then Augustus, another one we can learn from, won the civil war for succession, but as he put it, the Roman Empire was about to fracture like Alexander's did. He put in boring administrative reforms which worked, tax reforms which I liked which worked, had a sense of limitations, He drew the line in Europe on where the empire would go and no further. Most people come in when you're business, you think bigger is better. I grow, I'm successful, voila, give me more pay. And he recognized bigger is not always better. He drew the line because he knew it would undermine the empire to keep pushing those lines in Germany further and further, make defense more and more difficult. Sense of limits. And then, of course, he rebuilt Rome. The Rome you see in those Hollywood movies, all the marble, that was Augustus's creation. He also learned from his uncle. Humility, even though he had supreme power. He always dressed simply and always went out of his way to consult people even though he knew many of them did not have real power. He made sure they're involved in decision-making, would defer to them from time to time, because he knew if you always exercise that you're the supremo one, you're setting yourself up for a fall. And if you get constant feedback, maybe you'll avoid doing things that will end up destroying you. Good lesson in that. And this, again, I want to emphasize. Crisis will hit leaders. Sometimes it's your fault. Sometimes it can hit you for utterly extraneous reasons that you have no control over. But that's where you have to draw on your resources. How do you face something for which there is no playbook? Let me just hit a couple of modern leaders, and then we'll open it up. In terms of three that intrigue me in the book the most, one is Alfred Sloan. General Motors could learn from him today. Put yourself in his position. He's an accountant, comes out of a parts company. New stockholder comes, takes over General Motors in the early 20s. At the time, Henry Ford had 50 to 60% of the market. Nobody could make a car cheaper than Henry Ford's Model T. GM was a mishmash of different companies. No real managerial coherence, losing money, and a small market share. What do? How can you beat Henry Ford? He can undercut your price any and every time. Well, this is something to remember. A good leader does not accept the other person's rules of the game. In the case of Sloan, he rewrote the rules. First of all, since he had a lot of different models, he realized he wasn't going to cut Henry Ford in terms of pricing. And he recognized this accountant. If you look at his picture, he looks like an utterly boring accountant. You look at the picture, you're already falling asleep. And what did he do? He changed the rules. He realized cars aren't just a means of getting from point A to point B. It's fashion. It's about pizzazz. It's about a statement about yourself. So he introduced fashion, new modeling, and was aggressive on new technology. So each year he put in the annual model change, institutionalized that. So each year, what's the new thing? He allowed you to choose your color. Henry Ford said you could have any color you want as long as it's black. Choose your own color. He had, as he put it, a model for every pocketbook, from Chevy to Cadillac. He introduced something that seemed crazy at the time payments for cars. We think nothing of it today, but people thought, well, mortgage is one thing on a house. It's hard to move a house in the middle of the night, but with a car, as soon as you take it off the lot, it goes down in value. You're going to lend money a year, 2 years, 3 years on something like that? You're nuts. Well, he did it. Within 6 years, he surpassed Henry Ford. Stickler for detail, stickler for technology, but also recognize the intangibles of what stirs people, what will get them to provide your product. Another one, banking, APG and INE. Created Bank of America, a company that's pulling out of a crisis today. When he started, he did several things. Keep this in mind. He looked for markets where others weren't. When he was a young man, he saw that the immigrant community, he was in San Francisco, no one was serving the immigrant community. So he went to his local savings bank on whose board he sat and said, why don't we serve these people? And they said, are you crazy? There's no credit history with these people. They didn't have scores then, but they said, no scores on these folks. Are you crazy? He figured out, get to know them, judge their character. So he started what first was the Bank of Italy, and then changed it eventually. Bank of America has expanded. Served the immigrant community, went to merchant seamen, who were always served by loan sharks, allowed them to establish banking relationships with his new bank. Dealing about crisis, two quick ones. 1906, earthquake hits San Francisco. City's destroyed. The rumbling barely stops on the second hit. And he realizes something. The city's going to be consumed by fire. So what does he have the presence of mind to do? He brings wagons together, takes gold and cash out of his bank vaults, puts them on the wagons, covers them up with fruit, and moves out of the city. Why would he do something like that? Because he realized with those fires, bank vaults were going to melt, and banks weren't going to be able to get their cash and gold. So he pulled out of the city. The fires consumed the city. City was still smoldering, brings the wagons back in, goes in front of his bank, still smoking, sets up a bench, and says any merchant can come along and I'll extend you credit. Imagine the presence of mind in a crisis like that. But another one, 1933. Banks get closed in the United States. Treasury says they'll let the sound ones reopen. Giannini's competitors decide this is the time to put him out of business. He was a guy who was always lending to unusual people. He financed Hollywood in its early days, financed the nascent wine industry in California, kept Disney alive when Disney was in trouble. So they came along and said he's a big lender to agriculture, especially in the Central Valley. If you use mark-to-market, those loans aren't money good, even though some of them were still paying. Put this guy out of business. He had to suddenly go to Washington, use every ounce of political influence he could find to keep his bank alive. So even though he's the largest bank in the country, nearly destroyed by a crisis beyond his control. So where does that leave us today? In terms of the economy, we are recovering. Natural snapback from the huge fall we took in 2008, 2009. But we have some real issues out there which we can discuss in the Q&A if you have time. One is the state of the dollar. Cannot have prosperity, sound prosperity, without a sound currency. It's very basic. Money's supposed to facilitate, so you don't have to barter. Should be constant in value. It's like minutes in an hour. Imagine what would happen if the government decided to change the minutes in an hour each day to stimulate the economy. Let's increase the number of minutes an hour to 70 from 60. Why, then people would work longer at the same pay. Well, people would figure out what was going on. Or then labor unions would say, let's cut it to 45 minutes. That way, work less, get more pay. Keep it simple. Taxes. Raising taxes, raising the price of work, productivity, success, not a smart thing to do when you're trying to get an economy back on its feet. And one final thought, and that is the essence of capitalism, free markets. Under a cloud right now, but the scandals and the excesses, that's human nature. Just as you have voting fraud in elections, doesn't mean you ban elections. Because human nature has its underside in commerce, doesn't mean you ban commerce. You have sensible rules of the road. But sensible rules of the road, like speed limits, are very different from the government telling you what to drive, where to drive, and when to drive. Those are issues we face today. Free markets with sensible rules of the road work. They allow creativity. They allow people from the strangest walks of life or backgrounds to rise up. Just give you one example. Clothing. Clothing we've been wearing since cave days. Skins of woolly mammoths or bears or whatever we wore in those days. Several years ago, a kid in high school notices, plays football. During practice, you sweat, especially in late summer, early fall. Go through 8 to 10 t-shirts. So why not have a t-shirt that absorbs the sweat? So in college, this kid goes and examines, finds a fabric in medicine that's used for a very narrow purpose that absorbs moisture after a certain medical procedure. Use that technology, went to a tailor, created 8 sweatshirts of his own, tried to get his teammates to do it, wear them. At first they resisted. They said, it's silky, it's sissy. Not going to wear that, we're men. And he finally persuaded them. It worked. Company Under Armour, Kevin Plank. Truly, the communists love Kevin Plank because he's a man who made tons of millions of dollars off the sweat of other people. And so in terms of leadership, and stories are wonderful in terms of lessons of leadership, we all know the importance of character and integrity. We must also know we are going to get hit with curveballs, and dealing with success can be just as destructive as dealing with failure in terms of what it does to your mind. And that gets to the essence. If you don't have that inner core, you don't realize there is a higher purpose and a higher authority, you will succumb the way Alexander did and destroy everything you thought you set out to do. Thank you.